On the day of November 28, 1968, U.S. Army Sergeant Christopher Noble was born in Richmond, California. He was born into a family of 5 with 2 brothers, one brother of which has served in the military. Just like his brother, Mr. Noble too decided to enlist in the Army, to the dismay of his mother. When questioned about what branch he served with, Mr. Noble simply responded, "Army." When discussing his choice of enlisting, he explains why he chose so. "I wanted to serve my country and leave where I was living." He did so at the young age of 18 with no sights of college in his mind. "College wasn't so huge the way it is to these days, so I wasn't really wanting to go to college," Mr. Noble said. In the Army, Noble was a combat engineer. He also focused on attending airborne school and ranger school, so I trained for that, and then I also went to airborne training, I also went to air assault training, and I also went into ranger training. In the beginning of his service, Noble began his basic training at Fort Leonard Wood. Due to his young age, Mr. Noble did not understand the scale of what he was diving headfirst into. Terrorized, yes, I was a little kid, really didn't realize what I was getting into. I had an idea, but I didn't really realize till I got there what was going on. Despite this, Mr. Noble could eventually understand the reason behind the staff sergeant's brass personalities. They were, without a doubt, the most difficult men I've ever had to deal with in my life, but in the end, we began to respect him and understand what they were doing, Mr. Noble recalled. He would later go on to vouch for his superiors. If it wasn't for them, well, they showed us how to stay alive. After basic training, Noble attended his airborne training. As part of the Army, Mr. Noble had initially trained to be a combat engineer. We also constructed bridges, blew up bridges, and we also sweeped minefields, Mr. Noble explained while discussing his duties. Later, Mr. Noble would attend airborne school. I also went to airborne training, I also went to air assault training, and I also went into ranger training. In airborne training, Mr. Noble had sustained many injuries. I have a femur injury, I have a shoulder injury, and I have a back injury, and I have an ankle injury. Since I was an airborne unit, we jumped out of planes often. We always didn't have great jumps. We'd end up in the ground and it's hard on your body. In his career, Mr. Noble had deployed into a combat zone twice, the Arabian Peninsula and Panama respectively. I was deployed twice into a combat zone, Mr. Noble stated. As a sergeant, Mr. Noble acknowledged his extra duties and responsibilities. The military preaches that the guys under you are taken care of, and it's your job getting them home safe, and to make sure nothing happens to them while they are under your command, Mr. Noble expressed. Though, the life of a military career is much different than that of a citizen. Social life in the military is unique. You really don't socialize with people much outside of your unit, because you pretty much spend a lot of time with people in your platoon, Mr. Noble recalled. Mr. Noble served in many locations such as Germany, Italy, Africa, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and finally Turkey. When you were deployed, you'd normally stay for at least a month. The longer side where we stayed was in Saudi Arabia, where we stayed there I think 9 months. The best memories for Noble was in Europe. Mr. Noble went to World War II history sites. Some of them were houses that Hitler lived in, and some sites were hideouts high up in the mountains. I was like, man, it's one thing to read about it and one thing to actually go and see it. Mr. Noble was a demolition specialist in both Panama and the Persian Gulf. Mr. Noble's unit was a support role, and he helped people get evacuated. When I was in the Persian Gulf, we were clearing minefields, blowing up minefields, and fighting fires. When not on the front lines, Noble was cleaning his weapons, digging foxholes, training, and making sure his equipment was working right. Peacetime was the opposite. Peacetime was fun. You do PT often. You're constantly qualifying with your weapons to make sure you can shoot. But you get weekends off, and you get nights off, so when you're not in the field, you have time to live a real life. The Persian Gulf was like the middle of nowhere. All you saw was sand, 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 camels, camels, and equipment. We weren't there for very long, but for the short time it was a beautiful country. People were nice, but it was hot. The combat was brief, as said by Noble. Maybe only 45 or 30 days of actual combat I didn't see every day. You're basically fighting a force that wasn't even close to level. There was hand-to-hand combat and small arms fire, but there was no blowing up of the bunkers. The only way to stay in touch with loved ones back home was mail and a phone call once a month. In Germany, he could call however long he wanted, but it was expensive. Noble had 4 or 5 days off during R&R. We had time to get there, so we had time to take off to take showers, to eat real food. Hell, I was water skiing in the Persian Gulf, and it was fun. Mr. Noble was in his mid-20s when he completed his time in the military. He returned to Fort Hood and was picked up by his girlfriend. Mr. Noble was glad when he was able to come back home. at the age of 18 when he joined. He was homesick and missed his family. Adjusting to civilian life was a little difficult, but some things were the same. Waking up early to go to work and going to bed late, he did adjust well after some time went by. After getting back from service and adjusting to civilian life, Mr. Noble settled down and started a family with his girlfriend. He ate food, got to relax, and do all things that he couldn't do in the service. I learned to respect our country, I learned discipline, I learned how important your worries are, and I learned how important it is to do the job right the first time. Noble learned a lot from his time being in the service, but the most important thing he learned was to not take anything for granted and to respect everyone. Never take our freedom for granted. Always understand that you have a choice because you live in America, and unfortunately, people have to die for our freedom. But if you ever have the chance to make a decision if we should go to war or not, make sure you do everything that you can do before you shoot in rounds downrange. Thank you for your years of service to our nation, and thank you for sharing your perspective and experience as a veteran of the United States with us, Mr. Noble.